Welcome back to the Deep Dives, where we sift through the sources, extract the knowledge, and deliver you the most crucial insights. Today, we are taking an exhilarating journey into the deep past. Way back to an Ice Age Europe, we're going to meet the people who didn't just survive that frozen world, but really mastered it, the Cro-Magnon.
Yeah, it's a fascinating group.
When most people hear caveman, they think of these slow, club-wielding figures. We are absolutely here to shatter that stereotype today.
Definitely.
Cro-Magnons were the earliest anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, to settle Europe. They came migrating out of Western Asia.
Right.
And they weren't just, scraping by. They were building, inventing, thriving.
That's the key distinction, really. We are talking about the pioneers, the European early modern humans, or EMH, as researchers often call them.
EMH.
Their timeline starts astonishingly early. I mean, we have evidence suggesting continuous occupation, possibly from as far back as maybe 56,800 years ago.
Wow, that early.
It's debated, but yeah, potentially. And their successful settlement, that's what fundamentally defined the major Upper Paleolithic cultures. The Aurignacian, the Grevetian, and the ones that followed.
So these are names people might recognize.
They might, yeah. And their arrival, it was nothing short of a continental revolution they were interacting with and, crucially, interbreeding with the indigenous Neanderthals already there.
Okay, that interaction is key.
It is. But by the time these Cro-Magnon cultures really hit their stride, the Neanderthals had... well, they disappeared from the record. This happened roughly between 35,000 and 40,000 years ago. Essentially, yes. So the story of modern Europe, its deep roots, is fundamentally the story of the Cro-Magnon.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to cut through some of the mythology, maybe the pop culture ideas, and give you a deep, evidence-based understanding of this group. We need to extract the most surprising insights, their specific biology, which has some real twists, their incredible cultural complexity. I mean, intricate art, burials, even sophisticated architecture, and analyze how they adapted, how they thrived during the most extreme environmental challenges of the Ice Age, because ultimately, they shaped the blueprint for modern Europe.
That's the goal. #tag2. The name, the discovery, and the burden of history.
Okay, let's unpack the identity itself, starting with the name, Cro-Magnon. It sounds ancient, mysterious.
It does, doesn't it?
But the discovery itself was actually quite mundane, relatively recent, only 1868.
Yeah, it was completely accidental. And in arguably the most famous prehistoric region of France, Les Izes, in the Dordogne.
Right, the hotspot.
Exactly. They were building a railway line, the symbol of modern industry cutting through ancient land. And during the construction of the road for the new station, workers just dug into this rock shelter, the Cro-Magnon Abri.
Abri, the shelter.
Yes. Inside, they found flint tools, loads of animal bones, and these 5 skeletons. They were immediately recognizable as modern humans, Homo sapiens, but noticeably more robust than the local Frenchmen of the time.
More heavy-duty, so to speak.
You could say that, yeah. And the name itself, Cro, just means hole or cavity in the local Occitan dialect. And Magnon, that was simply the name of the guy who owned the land.
Huh. So an administrative label that can loaded with meaning?
Precisely. It's an administrative name that's now packed with historical baggage.
It's fascinating how context just completely shapes interpretation. When these kinds of finds started surfacing in Europe, before Darwin's theories really took hold, how did people even explain ancient human remains?
Well, mostly finds like this were explained away through a creationist lens, the prevailing biblical framework. They were seen as antediluvian peoples.
Antediluvian, meaning before the flood.
Exactly. Human populations supposedly wiped out by the Great Flood described in the Bible. It was really the only widely acceptable framework at the time.
Any famous examples of that kind of interpretation?
Oh, definitely. Take the famous Red Lady of Paviland, discovered in South Wales back in the 1820s. This was actually a male skeleton buried ceremonially, dyed red with ochre, and adorned with perforated shells and ivory rods.
A male skeleton called the Red Lady.
Yes. When it was first described, the theory was that it was maybe a Roman citizen, maybe a customs official, or even a witch. Later, the geologist Reverend William Buckland, a prominent creationist, assigned it correctly to the antediluvian period, but incorrectly gendered the skeleton as female.
Why female?
Purely based on the associated jewelry, the shells and ivory. It's a really stark, immediate illustration of how cultural assumptions just clouded scientific classification right from the get-go.
Okay, now here's where it gets, I think, really interesting and frankly, quite uncomfortable, but crucial for understanding the history of this field.
Mm-hmm.
Once Darwin's theory of evolution gained massive popularity in the late 19th century, the study of these ancient humans, including Cro-Magnons, unfortunately took a dive straight into, well, scientific racism.
Yes, that's a crucial historical point, and it's important we report on it impartially. The rise of evolutionary theory unfortunately coincided with the rise of racial anthropology. Practitioners back then, often called raciologists.
Raciologists, right.
They applied what we now know are discredited pseudoscientific metrics, mainly anthropometry, measuring skulls and bones to try and divide humanity into neat categories and, inevitably, hierarchies.
And they quickly slotted Cro-Magnons into this really toxic framework, didn't they?
They did. Cro-Magnons were sort of claimed by proponents of Nordicism and Pan-Germanism. They saw them as the perfect model of a superior Proto-Aryan race, tall, intelligent, robust, the direct ancestors of Northern European populations.
Proto-Aryans, wow.
And this was precisely the kind of historical justification that was later twisted and appropriated by the Nazis to push their ideologies of racial supremacy.
A very dark chapter.
It was, though it wasn't entirely uniform, which actually reveals just how subjective the whole methodology was. Raciologists categorize these remains based on physical traits they cherry-picked.
How so?
Well, the taller, more robust specimens, like the original Cro-Magnon finds or that Pavilion skeleton we mentioned, they were linked to the so-called Nordic race. But they couldn't ignore the variation they were finding in the fossil record.
Right, because not all skeletons look the same.
Exactly. They found smaller, slenderer remains, like the skull found at Combe-Capelle, also in France, and they kind of struggled to fit these neatly into their superior Nordic narrative.
So what do they do with them?
So they categorize them differently, maybe as forerunners of the Mediterranean race, or in some really quite absurd leaps of logic, even as Eskimoids, based on really crude and superficial comparisons of skull shapes.
Eskimoids, based on skull shape, that seems tenuous.
Extremely tenuous. And this classification mania extended even to their art. You take the iconic Paleolithic Venus figurines with their exaggerated features, the voluminous breasts, large buttocks, what's known as pseudopygia.
Right, the famous Venuses.
Some historical anthropologists interpreted those features as evidence of a supposed Negroid race living in Ice Age Europe, drawing these completely baseless connections to groups like the San people of southern Africa. It was pure projection.
We really need to be crystal clear here for everyone listening. This entire historical taxonomy, using terms like Proto-Aryans or Negroids or Eskimoids, it was built entirely on discredited pseudoscientific methods like anthropometry used at the time. This is the intellectual baggage that modern archaeology had to confront.
Absolutely. And thankfully, that burden was eventually largely thrown off. This whole historical race concept, it was mostly overturned by the middle of the 20th century.
What drove that change?
Several things. The positivism movement in science demanded much more rigor and objectivity, trying to free science from political bias. And perhaps most critically, the horrific association of raciology with the atrocities of Nazism provided this huge political and moral urgency to just abandon these pseudoscientific practices entirely.
Unnecessary rejection.
It really highlights the critical importance of understanding the intellectual and ethical context when we study history, especially the history of science itself. #Tech3, migration waves, genetic legacy, and the great skin color shift.
Okay, let's shift gears now, moving from the sometimes troubling history of interpretation to the actual history of their movements. Modern genetics has just revolutionized our understanding of how Cro-Magnons arrived, hasn't it?
Completely. We now know it wasn't just one single continuous movement into Europe. It looks much more like two distinct major migration waves.
Two waves. Okay, tell us about the first one.
The first wave, we associate this with what's called the Initial Upper Paleolithic, or IUP, and it started incredibly early, potentially, as we said, around 56,800 years ago.
Wow.
We see evidence for this in the Neronian tool industry found at sites like Mandrin Cave in France. These very early groups seem to have derived their ancestry from population hubs around the Persian Plateau region.
Okay, early pioneers from the east.
Right. But here's the first massive genetic shocker from this deep dive.
Buckle.
This first wave, despite being really innovative, they successfully replaced Neanderthal technology in certain places. They left absolutely no discernible genetic legacy in present-day Europeans. None.
Wait, really? They were successful technologically, but their genes just vanished.
They were the absolute pioneers, the first Homo sapiens wave to really break through into Neanderthal territory, but their specific lineage just disappeared. They were completely replaced by the people who came later.
That is staggering. So short-term success didn't mean long-term genetic continuity at all.
And not for them, no.
So the genetic story that actually matters for people listening today, the one that establishes the true CroMagnon foundation that begins with the second wave, the one that formed the successful founder population.
That's the one. The second wave started much later, maybe around 37,000 years ago.
Okay.
And this population succeeded where the first one ultimately failed. Genetically speaking, this is the lineage from which basically all subsequent Cro-Magnons descended. And crucially, it does contribute enduring ancestry to present-day Europeans, as well as to West Asians and some North African groups too.
So this is the bedrock population for Europe's genetic history.
It is. This is the genetic bedrock we're talking about.
And culturally, this second successful wave, this is the one that established that recognizable sequence of Upper Paleolithic cultures. Can you walk us through those main periods again?
Sure. So the Aurignacian culture was the first really widely recognized one. It spread rapidly across Europe shortly after about 40,000 years ago. It's theorized to have derived from the Near Eastern Amerindian culture, showing a clear link back to their ancestral homeland.
Okay, Aurignacian first.
This was the culture that truly dominated and quite rapidly replaced the indigenous Neanderthal Mousterian toolkits. Big change.
Then what followed the Aurignacian?
Then, around 30,000 years ago, the Grevetian culture replaced the Aurignacian. The Grevetian is famous for its specialized tools, like particular kinds of points and blades, and significantly for producing those Venus figurines we talked about earlier.
Right, the Venus figurines are Grevetian.
Mostly, yes. Its origin is still debated. Some argue for Central Europe, others point back towards the Near East or the Caucasus. But what's really crucial from a genetic standpoint is the remarkable social isolation that followed its establishment.
Isolation.
Yes. From that 37,000-year mark, when this founder population arrived, they remained genetically isolated from the rest of the world, from Africa, from the Near East, for a breathtaking 23,000 years.
23,000 years of genetic isolation in Europe.
23 millennia. It's an enormous amount of time for a population to evolve traits specific to that, frankly, brutal Ice Age European environment, without significant outside gene flow.
Wow. But before they settled into that long isolation, we know there was interaction with Neanderthals. You mentioned interbreeding. How clear is that genetic picture?
Oh, the evidence is undeniable now. The perhaps most famous example is the OACE-1 specimen found in Romania, dated to about 40,000 years ago.
OACE-1, right?
That individual carried a massive amount of Neanderthal DNA, somewhere between 6 and 9%. That implies a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back in their family tree.
The direct recent mixing.
Absolutely proves hybridization was happening, yes. However, looking at the bigger picture, that specific hybrid Romanian population, the one OACE-1 belonged to, it doesn't seem to have contributed substantially to the later European genomes that came after the Grevetian.
Okay, so maybe a localized event.
It seems like it, or at least their lineage didn't spread widely. And if you track the overall presence of Neanderthal genes in the subsequent Cro-Magnon genome over time, it gradually decreases.
It fades out. Why?
Well, the strong suggestion is that those Neanderthal genes were likely maladaptive in the modern human genetic background. Perhaps they cause slightly lower fertility or susceptibility to certain diseases, or maybe they just didn't confer a strong survival advantage in the new environmental or social context. So they were slowly selected out of the modern human gene pool over thousands of years.
Fascinating. Natural selection at work on that admixture.
Precisely.
Now, let's get to what might be the real aha moment for many people, something that completely upends the popular image. Skin color.
Yes.
We tend to visualize Ice Age Europeans as extremely fair-skinned, maximizing vitamin D absorption under weak northern sunlight.
Right.
What does the genetic analysis actually reveal about the earliest Cro-Magnons?
You basically have to throw out that common visual stereotype. The earliest Cro-Magnons, especially those from that initial founder population arriving around 37,000 years ago, would have generally had darker skin tones.
Darker skin in Ice Age Europe.
Yes. It's a massive surprise for many. Natural selection for the genes we associate with lighter skin in Europeans today, specifically mutations in genes like KITLG, SLC24A5, and SLC45A2, that process didn't really kick off strongly until about 30,000 years ago.
So well after they arrived.
Well after. And the selection pressure for lighter skin continued strongly right into the Mesolithic transition, sort of between 11,000 and 19,000 years ago, as diets might have changed too. The full transition to the very light skin tones we associate with modern Northern Europeans was actually a surprisingly late adaptation.
Driven by that need for vitamin D synthesis over millennia.
Exactly. Driven by the sustained environmental challenge of synthesizing enough vitamin D under low-angle sunlight, especially as populations became more settled or diets shifted. But it took a long, long time.
That genetic timeline for skin color brings us nicely to their overall physical form. Beyond skin tone, how did the Cro-Magnon body actually differ from ours today?
Well, fundamentally, they were anatomically modern humans like us. But, and this is a big but, they were incredibly robust compared to most present-day humans.
Robust in what way?
They possessed all the key modern features. A globular brain case, a flatter face compared to earlier hominins, a defined chin. But their bones were distinctly thicker, denser, and stronger, built tough.
And their brains. I remember reading something surprising about brain size.
Yes, in one sense, you could say they were even more brainy than us, at least in terms of volume. Their average brain volume was quite large, around 1,514 cubic centimeters. Compared to the modern human average, which is closer to 13,350 cc. So noticeably larger on average.
Does bigger mean smarter?
That's the million-dollar question. We can't equate size directly to intelligence, but the morphology, the shape, might matter. Their brains seem to have featured, on average, a longer frontal lobe length.
Associated with planning,
complex thought, executive function, yes. And also a taller occipital lobe height. So, while we can't make direct claims about intelligence, physically, they housed a somewhat larger neural operating system, perhaps necessary for coordinating the incredibly complex hunting, social strategies, and environmental knowledge needed back then.
And going back to that initial period, the interbreeding with Neanderthals, did any subtle Neanderthal physical characteristics linger in the earliest Cro-Magnons?
They certainly did, yes. Through that process of introgression, the flow of genes between what were then slightly different populations, the early Aurignacians, those first widely successful modern humans in Europe, sometimes still retain subtle Neanderthal-like traits.
Oh, God.
Things like a slightly flattened skull cap, or a slight bulge at the back of the skull known as an occipital bun. These weren't universal, but they popped up.
But they faded out eventually.
Exactly. These features gradually disappeared over time, which again confirms that sustained selection pressure, probably working against the Neanderthal genome in the long run within the modern human population.
Okay, let's talk about a really fascinating physical development that seems directly tied to their environment, the stature puzzle, how their height changed, especially around the last glacial maximum, the LGM.
Right. The LGM peaked around 21,000 years ago. It was the coldest part of the Ice Age. And the change in stature is dramatic and very telling.
How so?
Before the LGM, during the early Upper Paleolithic, say, the Aurignacian and early Gravettian periods, Cro-Magnons were surprisingly tall. Men averaged about 176.2 centimeters. That's around 5 feet 9 inches.
That's tall, similar to people today in well-nourished societies.
Exactly. Very similar to post-industrial populations. It suggests they were generally thriving, likely on a diet rich in protein from large megafauna mammoth, reindeer, bison.
But then the climate got truly brutal during the LGM. What happened to their height after the worst of the cold?
After the LGM, during the late Upper Paleolithic, like the Magdalenian period, their average stature plummeted significantly. Men averaged only about 165.6 centimeters, which is closer to 5 feet 5 inches.
Wow, a drop of over 10 centimeters, nearly 4 inches on average.
Yes. It puts them much closer in height to pre-industrial modern populations, who often suffered from chronic, low-level malnutrition or nutritional stress. This height drop is a really clear, undeniable archaeological marker of severe environmental pressure.
What caused it? Just less food overall?
It's likely due to severe nutritional stress caused by the difficulty in securing large, consistent game animals as the climate degraded, habitats fragmented, and those big herds possibly declined or became harder to hunt reliably. Their bodies were literally recording the hardship.
That hardship must have affected their population dynamics, too. You mentioned earlier maybe a 10-fold increase in population initially when modern humans arrived compared to Neanderthals.
Yeah, estimates suggest that during that transition period, the population of Western Europe might have increased significantly, perhaps tenfold. This could be due to modern humans having slightly higher fertility rates or maybe shorter intervals between births.
But life was still short?
Oh, absolutely. Despite any potential population growth, life expectancy for both Neanderthals and early Cro-Magnons remained tragically short, typically under 40 years old. Life was tough and dangerous.
And the Ice Age, especially the LGM, must have dramatically altered how they lived on the landscape, their mobility.
Hugely. In the pre-LGM world, the early Upper Paleolithic population density seems to have been extremely low. People were highly mobile, likely following animal herds across vast distances, and their social networks, their trade routes were extensive.
How extensive we're talking?
Well, to illustrate that high mobility, consider the evidence we find in some burials. We find perforated seashells, clearly used for jewelry or adornment, in burial sites deep inland, for example, in Romania, that were sourced from the distant Mediterranean coast. That means those shells, or the people carrying them, traveled nearly 900 kilometers or over 550 miles.
Wow. That implies really long-distance connections.
It requires complex social structures, knowledge of routes, maybe trade partnerships. It's indicative of a world with low population density and high mobility, where long-distance travel was feasible, maybe even necessary.
So what happened when the LGM hit hard? Habitable land shrank, ice sheets expanded. What did that do to their mobility and trade?
We see a really crucial societal shift. As habitable land contracted into refugia, these pockets of survivable territory, mostly in southern Europe, population density increased sharply within those areas.
More people crammed into smaller spaces.
Exactly, and this necessitated less mobility. You couldn't roam as freely. It likely led to the emergence of more regional economies with shorter trade routes. People focused more on local resources.
And how did they cope with the resulting scarcity, the nutritional stress we saw in their height reduction?
To cope, Cro-Magnons initiated something archaeologists call the broad spectrum revolution.
The broad spectrum revolution. Okay, what does that mean?
It was revolutionary because they seem to have consciously diversified their diet. They moved away from the high-risk, high-reward strategy of relying almost strictly on large, migratory megafauna like mammoth or woolly rhino.
Too risky when times are tough.
Potentially, yes. So they shifted heavily toward exploiting a much broader range of resources, more focus on smaller game, rabbits, birds, a greater emphasis on aquatic resources, fish, seals, shellfish were available, and crucially, a much wider range of plant foods.
So hedging their bets, basically.
Exactly. It was a trade-off. You get maybe less massive caloric payoff from a single mammoth hunt, but you gain much more stable, predictable food security by tapping into lots of different smaller resource streams. This dietary diversification was likely key to offsetting that nutritional stress we saw reflected in their decreasing height. It helped them survive the LGM's aftermath.
This need for stability, for diversifying, seems to have fostered incredible technological ingenuity, especially in their hunting toolkit. They couldn't just rely on chasing things, they needed better tech.
Absolutely. Their material science, if you want to call it that, was brilliant. They moved significantly beyond simple chipped stone points and relied extensively on bone and antler for spear points and other tools.
Why bone and antler? What's the advantage?
Well, think about impact. Bone and antler are more compressive and flexible than brittle stone like flint. This makes them much more shatterproof.
Ah, so less likely to break when you hit a large, struggling animal.
Precisely. That durability is vital when you're hunting massive, powerful animals like bison or giant deer, and they didn't stop there. The Grevetian culture around 30,000 years ago is credited with a major leap in projectile technology, the invention of the spear thrower.
The spear thrower, or atlatl. How did that change things?
It's basically a lever. It dramatically increases the kinetic energy, the range, and the accuracy of their spears or darts. It allowed hunters to throw projectiles much harder and faster, and crucially, from a safer distance from dangerous prey. A game changer.
And the innovation continued.
It did. Later, during the Magdalenian period, after the LGM, people further specialized their hunting gear. We see things like barbed harpoons, clearly designed for hunting fish or marine mammals, and other forms of possibly longer-range weaponry appear too.
Is it true we even have evidence of things like boomerangs?
There's a fascinating, though perhaps unique, find from a site in Poland. It's a curved piece of mammoth tusk, shaped very much like a boomerang, dating to about 23,000 years ago.
A mammoth tusk boomerang.
Yeah. Whether it was actually used for hunting small game or maybe for sport or ritual, we don't know for sure, but it shows a sophisticated understanding of aerodynamics and crafting shaped throwing objects.
And they didn't just improve individual weapons, they improved hunting strategy too, right? Especially after the LGM.
Yes, post-LGM, we see more evidence for large-scale coordinated hunting using game drive systems. This involved large communal efforts where groups of people would work together to funnel or corral entire herds red deer, bison, sometimes even mammoth, into confined spaces like natural gullies, narrow valleys, or perhaps specially built enclosures or pits.
For mass killing.
For incredibly efficient mass slaughter, yes. It was a way to maximize the return for the effort, especially when resources were tight and populations were maybe larger and more localized.
Okay, but let's make sure we're balancing the picture here. It wasn't all just man the hunter, was it? We know their diet needed more than just large quantities of meat, especially lean meat from game animals.
Absolutely critical point. We really must move past that outdated, overly simplistic man-the-hunter model. We have to acknowledge the vital and likely central role of woman the gatherer, or just gathering in general, regardless of who did it.
Why was gathering so essential?
For basic survival and health. Reliable plant items, roots, tubers, seeds, nuts, berries, and also small game provided not just calories, but crucial fats, vitamins, and biochemical balance. A diet consisting only of very lean protein, like you get from many wild game animals, especially in winter, leads to a condition called protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. It can be fatal.
So they needed fats and carbs from other sources.
They absolutely needed fats and carbohydrates. Small game often has more fat than large lean animals. Nuts and seeds are rich in fats and proteins. Certain roots and tubers provide carbs. Gathering provided this essential dietary safety net and nutritional variety.
Do we have direct evidence of plant use in Ice Age Europe?
Direct evidence is tougher to find in Europe compared to some incredibly well-preserved sites in the Near East. For instance, the Ohelo II site in Israel, dating back 23,000 years, gives us amazing context. Archaeologists there found evidence of sophisticated processing of over 150 different types of seeds, fruits, nuts, and other plant parts.
Oh, 150 types.
It shows the depth of knowledge they had. In Europe, the preservation isn't always as good. But we do have evidence from various sites suggesting they were definitely consuming things like acorns, which need processing to be edible, wild berries, almonds, and various roots and greens. It implies a complex understanding of the local flora, its uses, and its seasonality.
Okay, now for one of the most visually spectacular cultural adaptations, especially in those regions where trees were scarce, like the vast East European plain, the architecture. Mammoth bone dwellings. This just sounds incredible.
It truly is one of the most astonishing examples of human ingenuity in the Paleolithic. During the later Gravettian and Epigravettian periods, particularly in places like modern-day Ukraine and Russia, people built these substantial dwellings using the bones of their primary prey, mammoths. We found over 70 of these structures.
70. And they were like proper houses.
They were substantial structures, often used as semi-permanent base camps for hunting expeditions. Some were massive, reaching up to 12 meters, almost 40 feet in diameter. They clearly invested a lot of effort in building them.
Okay, walk us through it. How do you build a house out of mammoth skeletons?
It's quite remarkable structural engineering. They typically use the heaviest, densest mammoth skulls, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds each as the foundations, maybe partially buried.
Skulls for foundations.
Yes. And sometimes they position the massive, curving tusks with the tips pointing upward, possibly interlocking them, to act as key structural supports for the roof or walls.
Like natural arches.
Kind of, yeah. Then the shoulder blades, scapulae, the jaws, mandibles, and the long limb bones were carefully layered and interlocked, sometimes vertically, sometimes horizontally, to form the main walls and the framework for the roof, which was likely covered with animal hides.
Wow. And you mentioned resources were scarce. Did they use bones for anything else?
Yes. In areas where firewood was extremely scarce on the open tundra steppe, they even seem to have used smaller mammoth bones, broken up as fuel for their central hearths. Talk about maximizing resource use.
Incredible. Was it purely functional, or did aesthetics play a role?
That's what's equally important. This wasn't just about pure utility. At some sites, like the famous Mazin site in Ukraine, the mammoth jaws used in the walls were found stacked in striking, intentional patterns, chevrons, or zigzags.
Patterns, why?
There's no obvious structural reason for it. It strongly suggests these were purely aesthetic, decorative choices. It shows a sophisticated appreciation for design and architectural beauty, even in these functional dwellings built from bone.
Amazing. Finally, in this section on ingenuity and adaptation, we need to talk about their earliest and perhaps most enduring cultural companion, the dog, the Paleolithic dog.
Ah, yes, man's best friend, even back then. The genetic evidence suggests the lineage leading to dogs split from the lineage leading to modern wolves somewhere around the beginning of the last glacial maximum. So domestication, or at least the very start of that process, was happening right alongside their greatest environmental challenges.
So dogs emerged during the deep cold.
It seems so, and the archaeological record shows it might not have been a single smooth process. We see evidence of multiple, perhaps sometimes failed, domestication attempts. For example, the very old Goyet dog found in Belgium, dated over 30,000 years ago, was clearly a Canid living closely with humans, but genetically it doesn't seem to be directly ancestral to modern dogs.
So maybe side branches in the domestication story.
Possibly. But the relationship clearly deepened and eventually evolved beyond just mutual utility, like using dogs for hunting or guarding. We start to see evidence of a genuine emotional connection.
How can we see emotion in the archaeological record?
The best, most poignant example comes from Germany. The 14,500-year-old Bonn Oberkassel dog. This was a young dog, maybe 7 months old, found carefully buried alongside 2 humans, a man and a woman.
Buried with humans.
Yes. An analysis of its teeth showed it had suffered from canine distemper, likely multiple times. Distemper is a serious, often fatal viral illness in dogs. For this young dog to have survived that long with such a severe illness,
It would have needed help.
it would have required extensive, consistent human nursing and care. It would have been sick, weak, unable to contribute meaningfully to hunting or camp labor. Its careful, solemn burial alongside its human companions strongly suggests that, by the late Paleolithic, the bond wasn't just about utility anymore. It points towards deep emotional and symbolic attachment. If we want to try and access the Cro-Magnon mind, their consciousness, their beliefs, perhaps the best window we have is through their art. It's an incredible record left behind.
Yeah, the cave paintings, the carvings, they're iconic. But how do we interpret them? What do they mean?
That's the huge question, and the interpretation of Upper Paleolithic art has been a really dynamic field. It's moved a long way from the early, rather simplistic notion of art for art's sake, just decorating caves because they liked making pretty pictures.
Right, it feels like it must be deeper than that.
Most researchers think so. Theories have ranged really widely over the years. There was the idea of sympathetic hunting magic. You draw the animal successfully, and that helps you secure a successful hunt.
Makes sense. What else?
Then came more structuralist approaches, particularly from French scholars like Leroy-Gourhan, who tried to interpret the arrangement and types of images within caves as representing complex symbolic systems, often involving male and female principles or social divisions.
Okay, like a code almost.
Sort of. And then perhaps one of the most powerful and enduring theories, especially in recent decades, revolves around shamanism.
Shamanism. How does that relate to the art?
The idea is that much of the art, particularly the geometric signs and the strange anthropomorphic figures, might represent visions experienced by shamans during trance states. What archaeologists sometimes call entoptic phenomena, the patterns and shapes generated by the human nervous system itself under altered states of consciousness. The caves themselves might have been seen as portals to a spirit world.
Wow, okay. Let's dive into the cave art itself then. What kinds of things were they actually depicting on those walls, deep underground?
Well, the most famous subjects are, of course, the animals. They depicted a rich zoo of the Ice Age megafauna that surrounded them. Powerful bison, massive extinct lions, woolly mammoths, graceful horses, reindeer, ibex. Amazing detail sometimes.
Animals dominate. What else?
Geometric designs are also incredibly common. Dots, lines, grids, claviforms, club shapes. Their meaning is often very mysterious. And you have those powerful hand stencils and handprints where they place their hand on the wall and blue pigment around it.
The hand stencils are haunting.
They are. Interestingly, they almost never depicted landscapes or plants. There's one possible, highly debated exception at Chauvet Cave in France, which some researchers interpret as a depiction of a nearby volcanic eruption. But generally, it's animals, signs, and hands.
And how were they making these images, often in total darkness, deep inside complex cave systems?
Their techniques were remarkably sophisticated. Their paint box consisted mainly of natural mineral pigments. They used black from charcoal from their fires or manganese oxides. And for colors, they ground up minerals like hematite and goethite to create rich red, yellow, and brown ochres.
So, natural paints, how did they apply them?
They didn't just smear it on the walls. For drawing fine lines, they likely used solid crayons made of powdered pigment mixed with a binder like animal fat or plant juice. For larger areas of color, or for those stencils, they probably used pads of moss or fur to dab paint on.
And light, how did they see?
They illuminated the deep, dark recesses of the caves using portable stone lamps, essentially shallow bowls carved from stone, filled with animal fat, with a wick made of moss or juniper. These provided a flickering but usable light source.
And the spray paint effect for the hand stencils.
That's thought to have been achieved using blowpipes. They likely took liquid pigment into their mouths and sprayed it through a hollow bone or reed pipe onto the hand held against the wall. This created that characteristic negative image.
Some of those hand stencils seem to show missing fingers or bent fingers. What's the thinking on that?
That's a long-standing debate. Was it ritual mutilation, evidence of disease like frostbite, or was it simply a form of sign language, maybe bending fingers to represent a specific code or signal, or perhaps just the practical difficulty of keeping all fingers perfectly flat while spraying? We don't know for sure.
Okay, moving from the cave walls to art they could carry with them, we have to talk more about those iconic Venus figurines.
Grevetian period, right? Roughly 23,000 to 29,000 years ago.
Yes, the Venuses are primarily a Grevetian phenomenon, and they are the ultimate mystery sculptures, really.
Why mysterious?
Because these small, handheld sculptures, usually carved from stone, ivory, or bone, or sometimes fired clay, are instantly recognizable. They almost always emphasize what we see as secondary sexual characteristics: voluminous breasts, large buttocks and hips, steatopygia, a rounded abdomen suggesting pregnancy. But they typically lack facial features, and the arms and feet are often minimized or absent altogether. So, very specific features emphasized, others ignored. What are the interpretations?
They're still intensely debated. Early ideas focused on them being mother goddesses, symbols of fertility, perhaps used in rituals appealing for the fertility of the people, the animals, the land itself, a kind of universal female principle.
Makes intuitive sense for a population concerned with survival.
It does, but a more recent and quite interesting theory suggests they might be forms of self-representation by women.
Self-portraits.
Sort of. The perspective matches what a woman, particularly a pregnant or heavier woman, would see when looking down at her own body. The breasts, belly, and thighs loom large, while the face and lower legs are out of view. So perhaps they were intimate objects made by women representing themselves or the female condition.
That's a very different take.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Can we glean other details from them?
Sometimes, yes. The level of detail can be amazing. The famous Venus of Lespugue, found in France, for instance, seems to be depicted wearing what looks like a skirt made of twisted plant fiber strings hanging below the hips.
A skirt made of plant fibers.
It looks like it. It suggests evidence of surprisingly complex textile knowledge being applied even to clothing or adornment that long ago, something we usually don't see preserved.
And this capacity for detail and symbolism, it extends into abstract thought, too, right? Things that look like early notation or even maps.
Yes, there's evidence for abstract systems. We have clear examples like the Blanchard plaque, an engraved bone from France, which features rows of precisely marked notches, maybe 24 or 29 of them, carefully spaced.
What could those notches mean?
They've been widely interpreted as tallies, perhaps counting kills or days, or, more complexly, as early notation systems, possibly lunar calendars used for tracking the phases of the moon and therefore seasonality, which would be crucial for hunter-gatherers.
Tracking time. And maps. Do they make maps?
There's a postulated map engraved on a piece of mammoth tusk found at the Pavlov site in the Czech Republic. It shows curving lines that some researchers interpret as representing the local landscape, rivers, hills, maybe even the settlement itself. It's debated, of course, but it suggests the possibility of abstractly charting territory.
This capacity for detail, abstraction, planning. It seems fully realized in areas we might not expect, like textiles and music aspects of culture that are usually perishable and lost.
Exactly. And we do have glimpses. Some Grevetian sites in the Czech Republic, particularly the famous Dolní Věstonice complex, provide crucial, if indirect, evidence of a highly sophisticated textile industry much earlier than previously thought.
Textiles. How do we know?
From impressions left in fired clay. They show evidence of people using plant fibers, likely nettle or other bast fibers, to make not just simple cordage, but also knotted nets, maybe for hunting or fishing bags, and actual woven materials, including fabrics with complex twilled patterns.
Woven cloth in the Ice Age.
It seems so. This suggests a level of technological mastery far beyond just preparing animal hides. And significantly, this evidence for textiles coincides exactly with the proliferation of the sewing needle in the archaeological record.
Okay, tiny bone needles.
Yes. We find huge numbers of small, incredibly finely crafted bone and ivory needles at these sites. These weren't crude tools for punching holes in thick hides. The sheer number and fineness suggests they were capable of detailed sewing work, perhaps creating tailored clothing from woven fabrics, or applying intricate decoration or embroidery to their leather and fur garments for better insulation, fit, and maybe status display.
Okay, but for me, perhaps the most jaw-dropping evidence of their cognitive modernity comes from their music. Those incredibly old bone flutes, how sophisticated were they?
They are truly stunning. The earliest definite musical instruments we have are these flutes, dating back to the Aurignacian period, around 40,000 years ago, found mainly in caves in the German Swabian Jura region.
40,000-year-old flutes, what were they made of?
Often crafted from the hollow wing bones of large birds like swans or griffin vultures, or sometimes from mammoth ivory. And they weren't just simple whistles, they show precisely cut and positioned finger holes.
Deliberately placed holes.
Analysis suggests the spacing of the finger holes was done with intentional measurement, likely to create specific musical intervals. Some researchers even argue they might have been tuned to play in concert pitch or based on recognizable diatonic scales, like do, re, mi, re.
Playing scales 40,000 years ago, that's incredible.
It suggests a highly developed understanding of acoustics and musical structure. This isn't just making noise, this is calculated musical engineering. And it's not just flutes. Remember those mammoth bone huts at Mervezine?
Yes, with the decorative jawbones.
Some of the large mammoth bones found there, like shoulder blades, were painted with ochre and showed wear patterns suggesting they were struck repeatedly. The interpretation is that they might have been used as massive percussion instruments like drums, perhaps providing rhythm for dances, rituals, or communal events within those structures.
Music and rhythm deep in the Ice Age. Amazing. Finally, let's turn to their deeper belief systems and how they treated their dead. You mentioned earlier that formal burials were actually quite rare. What does that rarity tell us?
The very fact that formal burial wasn't universal suggests it was likely reserved for specific individuals, perhaps people of high status, or those who held a special symbolic importance within their society. It wasn't the standard way of dealing with the dead for everyone.
And when they did bury people, especially in the Grevetian period, some burials were incredibly elaborate, right?
Yes, the Grevetian period provides the most spectacular examples, particularly the world-famous Sungir burial site located near Vladimir in Russia, dating to around 28,000 years ago.
Sungir. What was found there?
Several burials, but the most famous contains a middle-aged man and separately 2 adolescents, a boy and a girl buried head-to-head. They were adorned with an extraordinary wealth of grave goods.
Like what?
Literally thousands, maybe over 13,000 in total, of meticulously drilled and polished mammoth ivory beads, which must have originally been sewn onto their clothing, forming intricate patterns. Plus hundreds of Arctic fox canine teeth, pendants, spears, lances, and daggers made of straightened mammoth tusk.
Thousands of beads. The work involved.
The sheer labor required just to craft those thousands of identical beads implies a massive societal investment in these individuals. It strongly suggests a complex society with significant social differentiation, where high status was possibly inherited at birth rather than just achieved in life because these were children.
Inherited status in the Ice Age.
It points towards that possibility, challenging older ideas of purely egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups. Interestingly, some individuals with severe congenital physical disabilities were also found buried with similar care and grave goods at other sites, like Dolny Vastanis. This has led to speculation that perhaps people seen as different held a unique, maybe even a shamanic or ritualistic role in their society.
Which brings us back to shamanism. The spiritual beliefs seem deeply connected to that based on the art.
The evidence strongly points that way, yes. We find these intriguing figures, anthropozoomorphs, beings that are part human, part animal hybrids depicted deep inside caves, like the famous sorcerer figure in the Grotte des Trois Frères in France, or the bison-headed man in Chauvet.
The sorcerers, what are they thought to represent?
They're often interpreted as representations of shamans, perhaps caught in a trance state, embodying or connecting with the spirit animals they sought to influence, appease, or draw power from. They might visually represent those trance-induced entoptic phenomena. We discussed the blending of human and animal forms seen in altered states.
And sometimes this ritualism seems to have extended even to the treatment of human remains in ways that seem quite dark to us now.
Yes. We have to address the clear evidence for complex, ritualized treatment of the dead that sometimes involved cannibalism or the use of human bones. Sites like Gough's Cave in England from the later Magdalenian period, around 14,700 years ago, provide unambiguous, if unsettling, evidence.
What exactly did they find at Gough's Cave?
Archaeologists found human remains that showed clear signs of butchery consistent with cannibalism. But more than just eating, there was specific ritual modification. Skulls were carefully cleaned and modified broken edges, smoothed to be used as skull cups.
Drinking cups made from human skulls.
It appears so. And perhaps even more specifically, an engraved human radius bone from the forearm was discovered. The engraving was a simple zigzag pattern, lightly etched, suggesting it wasn't accidental butchery marks but intentional modification.
Why engrave a human bone?
The interpretation is that this modification was likely part of a specific, non-utilitarian funerary or perhaps cannibalistic rite. It distinguishes it sharply from just simple subsistence, defleshing, or processing for food. It shows a very deep, complex, and perhaps to us disturbing engagement with death, the body, and ritual that went far beyond the purely practical. Hashtag Tag 7, conclusion and final provocation.
So, pulling all this together, the CroMagnon story we've uncovered today is just infinitely richer, more complex, and more human than that simplistic caveman stereotype allows.
Absolutely, miles beyond it.
We've explored people who navigated this massive biological and cultural transformation, shifting from being these incredibly robust, highly mobile, nomadic hunters focused on megafauna,
Right.
adapting to the brutal nutritional stress of the last glacial maximum, which literally reshaped their bodies.
We saw that in the stature decrease.
Exactly. And eventually settling into denser, genetically isolated, more regional populations that laid the groundwork for later European societies.
And their cultural legacy is just one of staggering technological and abstract sophistication, isn't it? We've seen shatterproof bone weaponry, cleverly engineered bone architecture, burials suggesting inherited status, abstract notation systems, possibly tracking time.
Textiles. Art that speaks across millennia, and even music created with acoustic precision, potentially aiming for concert pitch 40,000 years ago.
They didn't just endure the Ice Age, they seem to have used its challenges as a forge for incredible innovation.
So what does this phenomenal story of adaptation and ingenuity mean for you, the listener, today?
I think the Cro-Magnon people provide a real masterclass in human resilience, adaptability, and the deep roots of complex culture.
They are the essential foundation, both biologically, through that second wave, and culturally of modern Europe. They demonstrated that what we call behavioral modernity allowed humans to succeed, to innovate, and to build complex societies, even under the most brutal environmental duress imaginable.
And this brings us to our final provocative thought for you to ponder, looping right back to the beginning, to those two great genetic waves we discussed.
Okay, let's hear it.
The cultures associated with that initial Upper Paleolithic, that first wave, they were highly innovative. They were clearly behaviorally modern. They were here first. They mastered new environments. They replaced Neanderthals in some areas.
They seem successful.
They were successful culturally and technologically for a time. Yet their genes completely disappeared from the modern European pool. We owe our deep cultural heritage partly to the innovations likely pioneered or brought by groups like them, but perhaps none of our DNA.
So the question is,
It raises a profound question, I think, for those very first pioneering modern humans in Europe. Was achieving cultural and behavioral modernity, developing complex tools, art, symbols, was that ultimately a winning strategy for humanity as a whole, even if it failed to guarantee their own specific long-term genetic continuity? Did their cultural success pave the way, even though their lineage faded? Something to think about.